Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Laura Vogt. I'm the Curator of Education and Interpretation at the National World War I Museum and Memorial located here in Kansas City, Missouri.
And I'm Mila Henry, Artistic Director of the American Opera Project, a company based in Brooklyn, New York that is dedicated to the creation and premiere of new works of lyric theater. Tonight, we recognize the impact that women had on World War I and share their stories. Their voices will be brought to life through the reading of letters written by women throughout the world during this era, and through new original songs based on similar letters from the same time.
We're excited to welcome Jennifer Orth-Veillon, scholar and curator of the WWrite Blog, for a talk on women's participation in the Great War and its enduring impact. We're also so thrilled to share letters and diaries recently released from the Museum and Memorial's archive. During the pandemic, the museum team transcribed thousands of handwritten pages that are now available on our online collections database. We share 3 of those letters in the program.
Similarly, AOP has spent its time throughout the pandemic workshopping our operas in new and unusual ways. One of these works is the new chamber opera Letters That You Will Not Get, Women's Voices from the Great War, which features letters, poems, and writings compiled by Kate Holland and Susan Werbe and set to original music by contemporary composer Kirsten Volness. The opera premieres this summer in Brooklyn, but tonight we're going to give you a preview through music videos of 3 songs from the show recorded by the performers during our 2020 quarantine. This first song, The Dancers, is a setting of a poem by British poet Edith Sitwell, written perhaps in reaction to the 1916 Battle of the Somme, in which 20,000 British soldiers died on the first day of conflict. The poem's speaker is imagined feverishly dancing to keep the horrors of the war at a distance. Here is vocalist Caitlin McKechnie and the cast of Letters That You Will Not Get, performing The Dancers.
Are slippery with blood. The world gyrates too. God is good, that while his wind blows out the light, for those who hourly die for us, we still can dance each night. The music has grown numb with death, but we will suck their dying breath. The whispered name they breathe to chance, to swell our music, make it loud, that we may dance, may dance. We are the dumb, blind carrion fly that dance and batten, though God die, mad for the horror of the light. The light is mad too, flecked with blood. We dance each night. 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 We dance each night.
Hi, my name is Kelly Kennedy, and I'm an Army veteran who served in both Desert Storm and Mogadishu, Somalia. Since leaving the Army, I've worked as a journalist and author, and am now the managing editor of the War Horse, a nonprofit newsroom that works to lessen the military-civilian divide. I am honored to join you today to help share the incredible, untold stories of the women of World War I, thanks in large part to the incredible efforts of the World War I Museum in Kansas City, which has spent much of the pandemic transcribing and digitizing all the letters from their archives. To mark the celebration of Women's History Month, you will hear selections from the new American opera, Letters That You Will Not Get, Women's Voices from the Great War, by composer Kirsten Volness and librettist Susan Werbe and Kate Holland. You will also hear readings of newly transcribed letters from the National World War I Museum and Memorials Archives, as well as a keynote talk by Jennifer Orth-Veillon, author, historian, and curator of the WWrite blog that appears on U.S. World War I Centennial Commission website. We continue with two letters from sisters Clara and Alice Raz, who lived in Chicago, Illinois with their mother, a German immigrant, and their three siblings. During World War I, they often wrote to their friend, Corporal Reed Disman Fields, who served overseas in the U.S. Army. The first letter was written by Clara on June 15, 1918, and the second by Alice on May 15, 1919. In these excerpts, we hear these young women describe dancing as a way to forget about the horrors of war. Following this, you will hear a musical excerpt from the opera entitled War Girls. The words are from a poem by British poet Jessie Pope. Pope was a popular poet and journalist, best known for her patriotic and jingoistic poems published during World War I. Her poems enraged the British war poet Wilfred Owen. Today, it's possible to read her war poems in irony, and that's how librettists Kate Holland and Susan Werbe have chosen to interpret War Girls.
Our parlor doesn't look like it did there for a while. It looks dark and lonesome. We're all sitting in the kitchen. Mother just went in the parlor and put on that Scotch music. She is coming out in the kitchen dancing. I guess she feels like I do. We have to do something to keep us from thinking about the horrors of war.
You see, as I grow older and see more of the world, I have come to the conclusion that dancing is a very pleasing pastime, especially on rainy weather. I'm not particularly interested in Guyon's Hall. There are too many old birds up there. All the young boys like to go where they can get away with a little shimmy. Do they do that in Germany? If not, I will teach you when you get back to Shy. Last Saturday, Ethel and I went to Columbia Hall, and we sure did have some swell time. We danced every dance, and I didn't see any rough stuff pull off there. It may have a tough name, but since it was rated, it sure is tame enough for me. Of course, Mother doesn't know I went there, so don't let the cat out of the bag or there will be war at Rass's peaceful residence. We sure don't want to break our record.
Tickets for the train, and the girl who speeds the lift from floor to floor. There's the girl who does a milk round in the rain, and the girl who calls for orders at your door. energy and nerve. No longer caged and penned up. They're going to keep their hand up till the case holder boys come marching back.
Just got back from standing in line. The post was there all right, and also a letter from Mr. James Marion Price. Know him? Enclosing a perfectly grand character reference. He's a dear to give me one. He's good at making up nice things to say about folks. Not a word he said was like me. I wanted a recommendation from him because I knew his signature would mean something. John, you ought to thank your lucky stars every day for the dad you have. And mother, too, believe me. I got a little bit wild the other day. Accepted a position at $15 a week as stenographer for the head doctor and nurse at the dispensary. I thought it would be lonely, and I could come up here every Saturday and have the bright lights all the other nights. I hurried home and announced my intentions, only to be greeted by shrieks and groans from my family. They thought I was crazy, and said in tones none too sweet, "You're going to Pine." Ouch. And here I am, and darn glad, too, 'cause it's perfectly damn gorgeous.
Not much is known about Salah, the writer of the last letter, other than that, excuse me, other than that she was a friend of John Hoover Price, a musician in the 83rd Field Artillery. This letter, which was composed on July 15, 1917, was written while she was living in Pine, Colorado. If you would like to learn more about the museum's archival letter project, please visit www.theworldwar.org. Now we have a brief video telling us more about the chamber opera, Letters That You Will Not Get.
They're out to show their grit.
This new opera deals with women's journeys through World War I, experiencing the horrors of war, both at home, waiting for a letter that might indicate that a loved one might never return, or on the battlefield itself, where women served behind front lines as nurses or ambulance drivers.
One of the wonderfully unusual things about Letters That You Will Not Get is it features women's voices from World War I. Women's voices that for too long have been left out of the war's narrative. Now we have the opportunity to hear from women in their own words how they experience this cataclysmic event.
This show is entirely comprised from original women's writings at the time, poetry, journal entries, letters. And so suddenly we're getting to hear these women's voices and also consider their experience of this time. And we wanted to lift up those voices in art.
As a composer who writes vocal music, I find that my job is to illuminate those words and ideas, to create an immersive environment, almost world building, so we can all explore it together.
We are looking in a really different way at women's roles in society and women's reactions to various world events, as well as the impact that women have on those events.
It is a new way to look at the war, and it connects the war that was to the present.
There are plenty of underheard voices out there that we need to reach out to and listen to, and to let them participate.
It is my great pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, writer, scholar, teacher, and curator of the WWrite blog, Jennifer Orth-Veillon.
Thank you, Kelly, for introducing me. On August 26, 1970, Monique Wittig, along with a group of other French feminists and writers, placed a wreath of flowers on the tomb of the unknown soldier, a soldier who fought in World War I, located under the Arc of Triumph in Paris. The ribbon drawn across the wreath read, "The only person more unknown than this soldier is his wife." I'll say it again. The only person more unknown than this soldier is his wife. This action was repressed by the police. The women were all arrested, and the event was highly mediatized, and thus a disputed place of World War I memory became the birth of the French feminist liberation movement, which would provide the architecture for all French women's movements in the 20th and 21st centuries. While it could be argued in some ways that Wittig and her group showed a lack of respect for the male soldier's final resting place, she was, all the same, making a very strong statement about the absence of women's history in the history of war. As demonstrated by this dramatic gesture by Wittig, the traditional version of history tells us that war is fought only by men. It is only about men. The men are fighting to protect land, country, governments, civilizations. The men are fighting to protect the women and the children. This is not an untrue version of history. As we know now, it is just one version. I feel fortunate that I am only watching the war in Ukraine on the screen away from the bombardments. It's devastating, to say the least. But I can't help noticing the different kinds of women from all walks of life, all of whom share their part of suffering and of fighting. We see women fleeing with children, women in basements making Molotov cocktails. We saw an older woman yelling insults at a Russian soldier. And we see something we definitely didn't see much of during World War II or many other wars. We see women occupying higher ranks in the military. And even though the number is small, they're growing, we see them in combat. War is a story of the women and the men, about all of those who lived through it and those who voluntarily or involuntarily have carried its memory for generations. Today, we are lucky enough to hear this more complete story, a story in which women have always appeared, but have been rarely seen or heard. This is why the project of uncovering the history of women in war is not only monumental, it is also deeply layered. And we are tasked with not just telling the untold stories, but we must also tell the story about why the stories have never been told. In a world where a story on social media or on an online news source gives its subject but a brief, fleeting moment of exposure before evaporating into the unseeable matrix of data stocked somewhere unknown, it is clear that what we do with these stories, how we amplify them, is just as important as telling them. Letters You Will Not Get, this amazing project, not only seeks to memorialize women's experiences from World War I, it seeks to create a lasting, living narrative. Even those of us who aren't professional singers, we've probably sung enough songs to ourselves or to our children to know that putting words to song is by far the best way to remember something. Song is a primitive tool used in transmitting oral histories and cultures before they developed writing. And even when the words to these oral histories and song were written down, it was clear that putting them into text, by taking the breath, the voice, the body, and the music out of the stories, that some of the meaning was lost. And that's what this project does with incredible virtuosity. It's taking the letters of these women, their text, and breathing life and body and voice into them. We're hearing the screams, the tears, the whispers, the laughters, all the emotions that come through their letters beyond their written words. I think that's why what the Letters Project is doing. It is connecting World War I women to today in a soulful, meaningful way. I had the honor of curating a blog for the official United States World War I Commission, Centennial Commission, from 2016 to 2019, called the WWRite Blog. Now it's a book coming out this fall with Millspeak Books called The Limits of Their Longing. Contemporary writers and veterans reflect on the lingering stories of World War I. And with the book and the blog, this is what I aim to do, to practice the exercise of relating to the past and understanding its layered resonance in the present. Throughout these years, I solicited weekly blog posts from today's writers and veterans by asking them to reflect on the ways World War I had influenced their experience as writers, as soldiers, as humans. I was honored by the generous, enthusiastic participation from all the contributors. But perhaps the most interesting thing I got to witness was the way this history blossomed in so many diverse ways, especially with the women. I'd like to share a sampling of how these connections were made between the women of the past and the women of today. Several posts by women who are military veterans paid tribute to the path-breaking roles a diversity of women played in World War I as nurses, journalists, clerks, yes, as soldiers, and more. Tracy Crow, a military veteran and writer, took inspiration from Layla LeBrand Rogers, who also happened to be Ginger Rogers' mother. LeBrand was one of the first 10 women to join the Marines in 1918. These women called themselves the Marinettes, and LeBrand wrote a kind of manifesto about them. Of this manifesto, Tracy Crow says that LeBrand broke every rule of journalism. And as Crow quotes, "I can only imagine the force of retribution that would have landed across my typewriter in 1977 had I dared to turn in such an energetic piece full of over-the-top personal bias. Yet with every read, I fall more in love with LeBrand's unabashed exuberance and her eerie prescience." Kayla Williams, who was an Arabic linguist in Iraq, writes that she was able to do what she did thanks to, as she says, the result of trailblazing women who paved the way for the rest of us. This woman was Loretta Perfectus Walsh. Walsh wasn't the first to fight on behalf of America. That honor dates all the way back to the Revolutionary War, but the first to officially enlist as a woman, earning equal pay and benefits. Teresa Fazio, who served in Iraq as a Marine Corps communications officer and oversaw 2 platoons, wrote a piece after watching Peter Jackson's film, The Colorized World War I footage. Fazio wrote that the footage of the sleeping men in the film looked like her wire platoon during breaks in Iraq. Fazio remarks, "World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, its human aspect spanned all of them. By 2019, so many of our wounds have not grown old. As a result of combat, yes, but also from post-deployment mental illness, substance abuse, and suicide, part of the long tail of war wounds." Mary Doyle, an African-American writer who served in the Army Reserve, worked on a project involving African-American doctors who served and were stationed at Fort George G. Meade during World War I. In all of her research, she reports never seeing anything about the role Black women played in the war at Camp Meade. However, as someone who did exactly that for her country a century later, Mary Doyle remarked, "I can only guess that since their stories weren't written down, these roles will forever go unnoticed and unrecorded." And as someone who helps other military women write their stories, Dole is countering that terrible phenomenon. Jasmine Walker Matupali, also an African-American, served as an intelligence officer in Afghanistan and Iraq. She posted about her debt to Ida B. Wells, an African-American journalist, suffragist, editor, and activist. Jasmine writes, "Wells fought for voting rights and equal treatment for women who looked like me. During World War I, she sold Liberty bonds and distributed care packages to Black soldiers. But her fight did not stop there. She worked to defend Black men falsely accused of crimes throughout the country. Following the Houston race riot of 1917, Wells fiercely protested the hanging of 13 Black soldiers by a military court without recourse to appeal or review by the president." Jasmine concludes that in the face of inequality, just like Ida B. Wells, she always wanted to be rebellious. Contributor Feliha Hassan was the first woman to publish a book of poetry in her home city of Najaf, Iraq. It was called Because I Am a Girl. It was an incendiary work. It featured a woman with no head covering. Feliha was born amidst the ongoing Kurdish-Iraqi conflict, survived the Iran-Iraq war, and then was forced to flee Iraq in 2011 because she was on a militant's death list. She contacted me because she wanted to write something for the centennial. What she came up with was a poetry prose piece called "Have You Ever Tried to Write a War Poem?" Well, she doesn't criticize those who write poetry about war who have not been in war, but she does say that a war poem is only a war poem if it has been written by someone who lived through war. She writes, whether it's World War I or Iraq, no one can write a war poem where the reader can truly hear and see and feel the war moments inside it, unless they've actually experienced sitting on the edge of death and have been lucky to survive and to become a poet. What Feliha Hassan is arguing is nothing can replace the authenticity of the voices of those who experienced and lived through war, who fought war on the front lines or at home, or who harbored in a foreign land as a refugee or asylum seeker. These voices, Hassan might argue, are testaments that a woman did more than survive. She survived and somehow knew she was supposed to tell her exceptional story, for there was no one else who could do it for her. The women that wrote for the blog captured that authenticity as they heard those voices in a dynamic, living way. By drawing threads through their experiences and those of World War I, they have allowed us to become a more complete understanding, not just of World War I women or just of contemporary women in war, but to open our eyes to the ongoing reality of war that began in the past and is still in the process of writing itself. That is what this project is doing through the enduring, borderless medium of song and music. These women of World War I do have their place beside the unknown soldier in Paris under the Arc of Triumph. If not there, somewhere equally as important. They deserve to have their stories told and sung. They deserve to be known.
Last night was the first night that I have had many seriously wounded Americans under my care. Rogers in bed 63 was a fine American lad of 18. Upon appearing for duty at 7, the day nurses reported his condition as critical, advising me to watch him closely. Shortly after midnight, I found his pulse almost imperceptible. Parting the blue gingham shield, I raised the lantern and saw that death was but a matter of a few moments. Without opening his eyes, but sensing my hand on his, he smiled as he softly whispered, "Oh, Mother, is it you? I knew you'd come. You did get here, didn't you, Mother? Talk to me." I stood there, hurting all over inside, and in another minute or two, he was gone.
The letter you just heard was written by Alta Mae Andrews, who served in the American Red Cross and for the U.S. Army Nurses Corps. This diary entry was written on July 19, 1918, while Andrews was nursing in France. Next, you will hear the song, The Gift of India, with text written by Indian poet and political figure Sarojini Naidu. Her friend and colleague, Mahatma Gandhi, called her the Nightingale of India. The Gift of India is one of the few pieces in letters that directly makes a political ask. We will give you our sons. After the war, give us our freedom.
Lo, I have flung to the east and west priceless treasures torn from my breast and yielded the sons of my stricken womb to the drum beats of duty, the sabers of doom. Franks, and you honor the deeds of the deathless ones. Remember the blood of my martyred sons.
Thank you all so much for joining us this evening to bring voice to these important stories in women. If you are interested in learning more about these projects or the organization, please follow the National World War I Museum and Memorial and the American Opera Project on social media, and click that subscribe or follow button while you're watching from home tonight. To learn more about the premiere of this wonderful chamber opera, please visit AOP's website, AOP-opera.org/letters, created and performed by an entirely female identifying team, this coming July at the Irondale Center in Brooklyn, New York. Productions like these can only happen with the generous support of people like you, so please consider donating. Now please stick around after the credits to ask questions of our panelists, Jennifer Orth-Veillon, composer Kirsten Volness, dramaturg and librettist Susan Werbe, and Laura Vogt. Please write your questions in the chat window below or either on Vimeo, YouTube, or Facebook. See you in a moment. Hello all, and welcome back. We hope you enjoyed our presentation, and now we turn the floor over to you for the special live Q&A. I'd like to begin by introducing our wonderful panelists. Jennifer Orth-Veillon, PhD, is a writer, translator, and educator based in Lyon, France. She is published in the New York Times, The War Horse, Lunch Ticket, Consequence, and The Wrath-Bearing Tree. Composer Kirsten Volness, emotive soundscapes integrate electronics and modern composition techniques with jazz and pop influences. Irresistible, says the San Francisco Chronicle, and nothing short of gorgeous, says New York Arts. She is the composer of Letters That You Will Not Get. Librettist Susan Werbe is an independent scholar focused on the history of 20th century England, including the social and cultural history of World War I. Susan holds a Bachelor's of Art in English Literature from NYU and a Master's of Education from UMass Amherst. And last but not least, Laura Vogt is the Curator of Education and Interpretation at the National World War I Museum and Memorial. Founded in 1926, the Museum and Memorial holds the most comprehensive collection of Great War artifacts in the world? So our first question, did women actually fight in World War I?
They did, as a matter of fact. Not many fought on in combat, but when we talk about the global story of women and their contribution, they fought in Russia, and I certainly will pass it to someone else around the table to be able to speak to this. They were known as the Women's Battalion of Death on the front lines there, but then women were very near the front in many other capacities, depending upon which front we're talking about. And you can't forget the women who are who are on the continent of Africa, where there are battles taking place all throughout as well. So the concepts of what we might be thinking of women being near battle look different depending upon where that battle is occurring.
And I'd like to throw in that, following up on what you just said, Laura, that nurses in casualty clearing stations all along the Western Front, a casualty clearing station was right behind the front lines. So there were certainly battle deaths of women who were nursing there.
Okay. And how do I get tickets for the opera? Will it be coming to Kansas City?
We hope it will be coming to Kansas City. That is something we are in conversations about right now. But to get tickets, Kirsten, I think you might know, but I think you might need to unmute yourself first to answer that.
Yes, I would say the best way to learn this information would be to go to the American Opera Project website, and all of that will be updated as we have the information available.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. Other than the great work of the World War I Museum, what do you think was the largest impact of these women ladies on today's world?
Well, I can answer that as the blog that I did sort of bore witness to exactly in very precise ways how these women contributed to the way that women who are involved in war today. You know, we had Jasmine Walker-Multipally talked about Ida B. Wells was her inspiration for going into the Army in the first place. Loretta Perfectus Walsh was the first woman to enlist and to be paid and to be treated in terms of financially getting benefits. They were the first Marines. So I think World War I has had an incredible impact on the future of women, not just in the military, but also in the conflicts that were to come. And I just want to make an interesting nod to the Russian women, because it's hard to talk about that today, but I think it's really important to mention that they were some of the very first women in combat, and women who are in combat today and all over the world do look to them as inspiration.
In addition to women who fought in the war, there were also women who were opposed to the war. In our opera, we have a song that Kirsten has set to the most glorious music, Lida Gustava Heymann, who was German, who attended an international peace conference of women in 1915. And the song is exhorting women, women of Europe, which is what we have called it. It's an excerpt from a talk she gave at that international conference, and she is exhorting women to use their agency to stop the war. So I think it's also important to bring a range of voices into this conversation about how women reacted so differently from the war itself.
And I want to go back to Kevin's question as well, and thank you for the kind words. Women continued their efforts in World War I do have this enduring impact into today. it was Woodrow Wilson who rarely spoke about his beliefs on whether or not women should or shouldn't be allowed the right to vote inside the United States. It was in 1918 that he made a speech in front of Congress saying that women have already sacrificed so much for this war. Don't they deserve full citizenship? That's not the exact quote. You should look up the exact quote. But it really is because of that work and because of all of these efforts that were seen in that time, that the 19th Amendment, which provided the majority of women, not all women in the United States, the right to vote. It is women's efforts in World War I that changed the pathway within science. You've got Marie Curie, you have a variety of women scientists who start breaking some barriers down at this time frame as well, and they start leading the way, just as some of these other examples were given. So I think there's really not a space that women didn't in some way forward and set the foundation for what occurs in the 20th and the 21st century.
And sorry.
The other thing I was just going to quickly mention is what's so interesting, and that comes out in War Girls, is that women in World War I, and also it happened, as we know, in World War II, women were able to take the roles of men because men had gone off to fight. And so you had women who were bus drivers and mail carriers and a variety of roles they would never have played were there not a war. And although sadly, after the war ended, they went back to their more traditional roles very slowly. Those changes made a difference that continue to stay with us today.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention, as Laura said, right, there's not one place where they weren't important. And I think it's also worth mentioning that what a role they played in the rebuilding efforts. After World War I, groups of even American women who very wealthy American women went around France and helped with rebuilding efforts. Because as you said, Susan, right, there were many men that were gone, and they were gone permanently. And so women did have a large task of rebuilding too.
Were there romances between female volunteers and soldiers, or is that just what we see in art and literature?
This is not a volunteer, but we have a fabulous excerpt that Kate Holland, my co-librettist, did such a great job of taking a letter from a young British woman named Ivy and just extracting the essence. And again, I love what Kirsten has done in terms of setting it to music. And the name of the letter is Dear Jack. And this is someone who's comfortably in England and has taken up with Jack's best friend. And in the meantime, Jack's in the trenches. And I just would love to share a smidgen of it. It says, "My dear Jack, everything must be over between us. Write back as soon as you can to say you forgive me, Jack. Shall wait impatiently for your answer. All at home send their love to you. Trusting this will find you in the best of health, I remain very sincerely yours, Ivy." We don't know whether Jack ever got it, whether he survived the war, but it's a wonderful example of, and in a way, a very serious example, a fun way of talking about what happened so that women who were left behind, what that did to relationships. It's a light moment in the opera, however.
Sorry.
Oh, and I would just say, we do have light moments equally at the National World War I Museum and Memorial. To be able to steward these letters and these diaries, with a global collection, it's incredible to see and to read kind of the humor and the love, as was read earlier, beautifully read earlier by, I think it was Alice, and talking about how she's just going out and wanting to shimmy. You do have these adolescents that are being lived out on a global stage. And so I can guarantee having read some of those letters and some of those diaries, that yes, there absolutely were romances that were taking place, some of them slightly unrequited, and would invite all of you to go take a look at those letters and those diaries yourselves. Go to www.theworldwar.org, and you can fall down that kind of primary source rabbit hole and read about it yourselves. And I also just need to add to what Susan said. Kirsten, the music brings such life to these words. It's really incredible.
How did you choose? What was your process for deciding which letters? I mean, it must have been sort of overwhelming.
Actually, I loved it. Kate and I have worked on 3 projects now, this being the most recent one, I hope to say. And I looked at primary sources mainly and just collected a basket full of text. And then Kate and I sat together. And one thing that happened, and this is a big nod to Kate, is her ability, again, to extract the essence. So we have the first song in the opera, Dear Alice, is actually excerpts from a range of letters. And it's a range of letters from women from a variety of countries, and not only white European women, but also women of color from Africa, from India, Black American women. This was something that was really important to us. But by doing that, by trying to be as inclusive as possible and diverse as possible and as global as possible, we hope to tell the story. And then we took that libretto and handed it to Kirsten for the next step.
Yeah, and I really tried to treat these letters as though they were, some of them are actually anonymous letters people wrote. Some are famous poems that other people have said before and have heard of. But I really wanted to treat them equally as though they were almost popular songs. So each of the songs is maybe 2 or 3 minutes long, except for the ensemble numbers that are involving more characters and a longer sort of arc. But it's really exciting to get to work with these wonderful characters and these archetypes that we're really casting them as. They don't have individual names in the opera, but they appear more as nurses or as mothers, so that you can't tell what side they're on. Everyone is sort of sharing this experience together, even though they're all very unique.
Why use opera to tell history?
Well, I would say from my point of view, music connects with people on a different level, I would say, than just reading a book or even visiting the museum. It has this engagement in real time that, can conjure emotions and thoughts and ideas and start conversations. And the theater just maximizes that. And so if an opera really allows us to create this immersive experience and place in which we can explore these stories and really get a sense of what it was like to be these people and how they were living, what it feels like, because it is resonating very clearly today in things we are going through in 2022.
My grandmother lost her first love in the Great War. Have these type experiences been looked at as an influence on post-war America? That's a deep question.
It is a deep question. We actually have a poem that Kirsten set to music by a British poet, May Wedderburn Cannon, When the Vision Dies. And she was someone who lost her first love, who had survived 4 years of fighting and did not want to become engaged to May Wedderburn Cannon because he felt if something happened to him, that would not be fair to her. She supported the war, she worked for the war, and at the end of the war, he asked her to marry him. And then in February of 1919, he was in Germany, and he was so run down by being in the war that he caught the flu, was involved in the pandemic and died of pneumonia. And what fascinated me, I actually met her granddaughter at a conference in Oxford several years ago, and she talked about her grandmother. And until her grandmother died, she supported the war. She thought it was a just war. She thought it was a war that needed to be fought and won. And she said famously, I went to war with Rupert Brooke, who was a World War I poet. And I could not come home with Siegfried Sassoon, who was also a World War I poet, but very anti-war. Much of his writing was very anti-war. So to the day she died in the 1970s, she was someone who believed in the First World War. I'm sure there are people in this country as well who had a very similar experience.
From Paulina Garza, were the women who fought in combat discriminated against? Can you touch a bit on the treatment they had? And thank you for this lovely presentation.
Jennifer, would you like to take that one?
I have to say that since I don't know the answer to that, because there weren't very many women in combat, and unfortunately I don't know the history of the way that the Russian women were treated in combat. So I can't answer that specific question. I would say that in general, even though there were a lot of advances made by women and for women during World War I do think that in general, if we talk about discrimination, I think they were appreciated and respected for what they did. But I also think that there was an overall discrimination because women couldn't do what the men could do. So I think that there was discrimination.
And when you go take a look, I always feel that some of my, we've done our job if you continue to look for the answers to your questions at the end of a program like this. So take a look for the Women's Battalion of Death, and what you'll find is that there was a very charismatic woman whose name is escaping me at the moment, and I apologize. And she said that she could bring together a group of women who could do a better job than the men were doing at the time, and it did become kind of well publicized in that moment, and right in this moment of a real crush of what's occurring in Russia. You will find that they aren't well known later on in history. Some of that information is actually only more recently being discovered and shared. So there's discrimination in the telling of that history as well.
Yeah, interestingly, when they started moving women to combat roles recently, they looked back at the Soviet women, the Russian women of World War I, and the war reporters too. Like if the war reporters can handle it, women can handle war too. So I think we've got time for one more question. Which female figure from World War I do you admire most? And this is from Melody.
That's a hard one.
Well, I can say that I have many women. Since I'm focused on writing, I do have two women that I admire very much and how they wrote and the bravery with which they wrote their tales. And they were both nurses in World War I. Mary Borden and Ellen Lamont were both nurses, and they, especially Mary Borden, they wrote in this incredible style. And even I think Ellen Lamont is credited with giving Hemingway his signature style. So those women are inspiring to me because they wrote about war in ways that no other women or men wrote about war. Lyrical, but also horrific at the same time. It just devastatingly beautiful, but devastating all the same.
We have an excerpt from Ellen Lamont in the opera, and it was so interesting to notice the Journal of Belgium, I think it's called, her journal, which was published in 1916, as you say, Jennifer. It was so horrific. It was banned from publication and was not published again until the 1930s. I would just like to call out women of color, whether they are women in Africa or women in India. I so admire Sarojini Naidu, who Angel sang her song so beautifully, the Song of India. I also, Addie Hutton and Katherine Johnson, who were two African-American women who went over to France to look at what was happening with African-American soldiers, but also African-American nurses. So if I had to name women that I really admired, they would certainly be among them.
This has been absolutely wonderful. I feel like I learned so much and I just want to go and see the whole thing. I hope the audience feels that way and that you'll continue to explore the archive as well as to learn more about this opera project. Thank you so much for this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.